The water truce, poor ranchers' kindness that changed Wild West history. The land stretched wide and endless under a burning sun. Dust rose in small clouds whenever a foot stepped on the dry ground. Cracked soil spread in every direction like broken glass, and the air carried a heavy heat that made breathing feel difficult. This was a lonely part of the Wild West, far from busy towns and crowded streets. It was a place where only the toughest people could survive, yet even they struggled against nature's harshness. In the middle of this dry land stood a small, worn-out ranch. The wooden house looked old and tired, its paint peeling and its roof patched in many places. A broken fence surrounded the property with several missing planks that had never been replaced. Behind the house stood a small barn, barely strong enough to protect the few animals inside. The ranch did not look like much, but to its owner it was everything. Thomas Hale lived there with his wife Mary and their young son Jacob. They were not rich, not even close. Their clothes were faded from years of use, and their hands were rough from endless work. Every morning before sunrise, Thomas would step outside and stare across his land, hoping to see even the smallest sign of rain. But most days the sky remained clear and empty, offering no relief. Thomas was a tall man with weathered skin and deep-set eyes. His face showed years of hardship, yet there was kindness in his expression. He spoke softly and rarely raised his voice. In the nearby town, people knew him as a quiet, honest man who never cheated anyone, even when he barely had enough for himself. Some admired him for this, while others thought he was foolish for being so generous in such a difficult world. Each day began the same way. Thomas woke before dawn, kissed his sleeping wife, and stepped into the cool morning air. He walked toward the barn, listening to the faint sounds of his cattle moving inside. There were not many. Only a small herd that barely provided enough milk and meat to support his family. Still, he treated them with care, brushing them gently and making sure they had whatever water he could spare. Water was the most precious thing in this region. The nearest river flowed several miles away, and the closer water sources were mostly controlled by wealthy ranchers. These powerful men owned large lands, hundreds of cattle, and many workers. They built strong fences and hired guards to protect what they believed belonged only to them. To them, a poor rancher like Thomas was not worth their attention. Mary often helped Thomas with their daily tasks. She tended to a small garden behind the house, though the dry soil made it nearly impossible to grow anything. Still, she tried, planting seeds carefully and watering them sparingly. She was a gentlewoman with a calm voice, always encouraging her husband when he felt tired or hopeless. Jacob, their son, was curious and full of energy, always asking questions about the land, the animals, and the distant mountains that shimmered in the heat. Despite their struggles, the Hale family shared a deep bond. In the evenings, after a long day of work, they would sit together on the front porch, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. The sky turned shades of orange and purple, and for a brief moment the land looked almost beautiful instead of harsh. Thomas would tell his son stories about brave travelers, honest cowboys, and the importance of kindness in a difficult world. But life was far from easy. That particular summer, the drought grew worse than anyone could remember. Weeks passed without a single drop of rain. The grass turned brown and brittle, cracking under every step. Cattle from many ranches began to grow thin and weak. Even the powerful ranchers who once felt safe started to worry. In town, tension filled the air. People whispered about fights breaking out over water rights. Some settlers packed up and left, fearing that the land would no longer support them. Others stayed, hoping that things would improve, though deep down they knew the situation was growing desperate. Thomas felt the pressure more than most. His small water well, which he had dug years ago, was slowly running dry. He carefully rationed every drop, giving just enough to keep his cattle alive and his family healthy. Some days he would walk miles under the scorching sun just to check if any distant stream still held water. One afternoon, while Thomas was working near his barn, a group of riders passed by in a cloud of dust. They were men from a wealthy neighboring ranch, wearing clean clothes and wide-brimmed hats. Their horses were strong and well-fed, unlike Thomas's tired animals. They barely glanced at him as they rode past, laughing loudly among themselves. Jacob watched them with wide eyes. "Father, why do they have so much when we have so little?" he asked. Thomas paused, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because they were lucky, and we were not," he said gently. "But that does not make them better than us, nor does it make us less." That night, as the family sat around their small wooden table for dinner, Thomas could see worry in Mary's eyes. Their meal was simple: a little bread, some milk, and a small portion of meat saved for special occasions. Mary spoke softly, asking if he thought they would make it through the drought. Thomas looked around their humble home. The walls were bare, the furniture old, yet filled with memories of their life together. He took a deep breath before answering. "We will try our best," he said. "And as long as we have each other, we will not give up." Outside, the wind howled across the empty plains, carrying with it the dry scent of dust. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly, though no rain followed. The drought seemed to stretch endlessly, like a dark shadow hanging over every living thing. In the following days, Thomas noticed something troubling. The river, which had always flowed steadily, was beginning to shrink. Large rocks that had once been hidden beneath the water now stood exposed. Even the powerful ranchers seemed uneasy, arguing among themselves about how to control what little remained. One evening, as Thomas returned home from checking his well, he saw a small crowd gathered near the edge of town. People were speaking loudly, pointing toward the horizon. Curious, he rode closer and listened. Two groups of ranchers were in a heated argument over access to the river. Voices were raised, and for a moment it seemed like the conflict might turn physical. Town leaders tried to calm them, but their words fell on deaf ears. The tension was thick, like a storm about to break. Thomas stood silently, watching the scene with a heavy heart. He could see that fear and desperation were driving these men to act harshly. Yet he also felt that fighting over water would only make things worse for everyone. That night, sleep did not come easily. Thomas lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling of his small home. He thought about his family, his land, and the fragile balance that kept them alive. He knew that if the drought continued, they might lose everything. Before dawn, he rose quietly and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the stars still shimmered faintly above. He walked toward his well, running his hand along the rough stone edge. This well had been dug with great effort years ago, when he first settled on the land. Back then, water had been easier to find, and he had saved some in hidden storage beneath the ground. As he stood there, Thomas felt a strong sense of responsibility. He was only one poor rancher, but he cared deeply about his family and his community. The thought of others suffering, even those who had treated him unfairly, weighed heavily on his mind. He looked across the dark horizon, where the first light of morning was beginning to appear. A soft glow painted the sky, slowly pushing back the night. In that quiet moment, Thomas felt something stir inside him, a belief that kindness, even in the harshest land, could still make a difference. The ranch remained silent except for the gentle rustling of the wind. In the distance, a lonely coyote howled, its voice echoing across the empty plains. Thomas took one last deep breath, knowing that the days ahead would be difficult, perhaps the hardest he had ever faced. But as the sun slowly rose, bathing the dry land in golden light, he felt a quiet determination. No matter how harsh the Wild West became, he would hold on to his honesty, his compassion, and his belief that doing what was right mattered more than wealth or power. As the days passed, the heat grew even stronger. The sun hung high in the sky like a burning fire, showing no mercy to the land below. Every morning, Thomas Hale stepped outside and felt the same dry air against his face. The ground seemed even more cracked than before, and the grass that once covered the fields had turned into thin, lifeless strands. In town, the atmosphere had changed. What was once a quiet place where people greeted each other with friendly nods had turned tense and uneasy. Men stood in small groups, speaking in low voices. Some carried rifles on their shoulders, not for hunting, but as a sign of strength. Fear and suspicion filled the air like dust in a storm. Thomas noticed these changes as he rode into town one morning to trade a small amount of milk and cheese for basic supplies. His horse moved slowly, its head low from the heat. As he tied it near the general store, he saw several wealthy ranchers standing outside, arguing loudly. Their voices echoed across the wooden street. One tall man with a thick beard pointed angrily toward the west, while another slapped his hand against a wooden post. They spoke about the river, blaming each other for taking too much water. Each claimed that their cattle needed it more than the others. Thomas stood quietly nearby, pretending to examine his supplies, but listening carefully. He could hear the bitterness in their words. These men had once worked together when times were good, but now, in desperation, they saw each other as enemies. Inside the store, the shelves were nearly empty. The shopkeeper, Mr. Sanders, looked tired and worried. His usual cheerful smile had faded, replaced by deep lines of stress on his face. When Thomas placed his goods on the counter, Mr. Sanders sighed softly. "Things are getting bad, Thomas," he said in a low voice. "People are scared. They don't know what to do." Thomas nodded, handing over the milk jars. "I can see that," he replied gently. "But fighting will not bring the rain back, Mr. Sanders shook his head. "I wish everyone thought like you." As Thomas left the store, he noticed that more riders were passing through town than usual. Some wore badges hired as guards by the big ranches. They carried themselves proudly, watching everyone with sharp eyes. Their presence made many people uneasy, including Thomas. That afternoon, as Thomas rode back toward his ranch, he saw something that troubled him deeply. Along the main path leading to the river, a new fence had been built overnight. It stretched across the dusty ground, blocking access for smaller ranchers like him. At regular intervals, armed men stood guard, watching anyone who came too close. Thomas slowed his horse and observed from a distance. He could see that the fence belonged to the largest ranch in the area, owned by a man named William Carter. Carter was known for his wealth, his influence, and his stubborn nature. Many people feared him, while others secretly disliked him. As Thomas continued home, his thoughts grew heavy. He realized that the conflict over water was becoming more serious than he had first imagined. It was no longer just arguments in town. It was turning into a battle of power. That evening, he sat with his family on the porch as the sun dipped low in the sky. Jacob played with a small wooden toy, while Mary quietly mended an old shirt by lantern light. Thomas stared across the plains, his mind filled with worry. Mary noticed his silence. "You look troubled," she said softly. Thomas sighed. "The big ranchers are fencing off the river. They are guarding it like treasure." Mary placed her hand over his. "What does that mean for us?" "It means water will be even harder to get," Thomas replied, "and if things get worse, people may start doing dangerous things." In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, raising a brief hope that rain might come. But the clouds drifted away, leaving the sky clear and cruel once again.
Over the next few days, tension continued to rise.
Thomas saw more signs of conflict whenever he went into town. Some smaller ranchers gathered together, angry and desperate. They felt that the wealthy landowners were stealing what nature had meant for everyone. One morning, Thomas woke before dawn and decided to ride toward the river to see the situation for himself. The air was cool, and the stars still glimmered faintly. He mounted his horse and moved slowly across the silent land. As he approached the river, he noticed something alarming. The water level had dropped significantly. Large stones jutted out from the shallow stream, and the once steady flow had slowed to a weak trickle in some places. Birds that used to gather there were gone, and the surrounding plants looked dry and brittle. Thomas felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He realized that if the drought continued, the river might disappear completely, and if that happened, the conflict between ranchers would only grow worse. While standing there, he heard distant voices. Two groups of men were arguing near the water's edge. One group wore the colors of William Carter's ranch, while the other belonged to a rival named Samuel Brooks, who also owned a large cattle operation. The men shouted at each other, accusing one another of taking more than their fair share. Their horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Though no one fired a weapon, the threat of violence hung heavily in the air. Thomas watched from a distance, hidden behind a small cluster of rocks. He felt torn between fear and concern. Part of him wanted to ride away, but another part knew that this situation could affect everyone, including his own family. After a while, the groups finally separated, each returning to their own land with angry faces. Thomas remained where he was, staring at the shrinking river. He could almost feel the land's pain, as if it were crying out for relief. On his way back home, Thomas noticed that some settlers had begun leaving the area. Their wagons rolled slowly across the dusty road, loaded with whatever belongings they could carry. Children peeked out from behind stacks of boxes, their faces tired and uncertain. Thomas felt a deep sadness seeing this. This land had been their home, just as it was his. Yet now, many were being forced to abandon it because of the drought and the growing conflict. That night, as he lay in bed beside Mary, Thomas could not sleep. He stared into the darkness, listening to the faint whistle of the wind outside. His thoughts kept returning to the river, the fences, and the angry men who were willing to fight over every drop of water. He remembered the small well on his own land, the one he had carefully preserved over the years. It was hidden beneath a wooden cover, known only to him and his family. Though it was not large, it still held precious water. A question formed in his mind. What if this well could help more than just his family? What if it could be used to calm the conflict instead of feeding it? But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Sharing his limited water with others could put his own family at risk, yet the idea lingered, refusing to disappear. The next morning, Thomas woke early and walked toward his well. He removed the wooden cover and looked down at the clear water below. It shimmered softly in the rising sunlight, a rare and beautiful sight in such a dry land. He knelt beside it, placing his hand against the cool stone. In that moment, he felt the weight of responsibility more strongly than ever. He was just one poor rancher, but he could see that something needed to change before things spiraled out of control. As he stood up, he noticed a small group of riders approaching from the distance. They were men from one of the big ranches, clearly searching for additional water sources. Thomas felt his heart race, but he remained calm. The riders slowed as they reached his property. Their leader, a stern-looking man, tipped his hat slightly. "Morning," he said gruffly. "We're checking nearby lands for any water that might still be available." Thomas nodded politely. "There is not much left anywhere," he replied honestly. The man studied him for a moment before riding off again. Thomas watched them disappear into the horizon, feeling both relief and unease. By midday, the heat returned with full force. The sky shimmered with waves of hot air, making distant objects appear to dance. Thomas spent the rest of the day tending to his cattle, but his mind remained elsewhere. In the evening, as he sat once again on the porch with his family, he heard distant shouting carried by the wind. It came from the direction of the river. Though he could not see what was happening, he knew that another argument had likely broken out. Mary looked at him with worried eyes. "Do you think it will get worse?" she asked. Thomas hesitated before answering. "I fear that it will," he said quietly. "Unless something changes!" Jacob, sitting beside them, looked up at his father. "Will the river come back?" he asked innocently. Thomas forced a small smile. "I hope so, son." "I hope so." As darkness fell, the stars began to appear one by one across the vast sky. The land grew silent, but beneath that silence lay tension, fear, and uncertainty. The drought had turned neighbors into rivals, and desperation was slowly replacing reason. Yet in the quiet of that night, Thomas felt a flicker of determination growing inside him. He knew that the coming days would bring difficult choices, but deep down, he believed that kindness and wisdom could still find a way, even in the harshest of times. And so, while others prepared for conflict, the poor rancher sat beneath the endless sky, quietly thinking about how one small act might change everything. The night had passed slowly, and the first light of dawn crept across the dry plains. The sky was pale pink and orange, but there was no sign of rain. Thomas Hale stood outside his small wooden house, listening to the quiet morning sounds. His cattle shifted gently inside the barn, and a cool breeze brushed across his face before the heat of the day returned. He had hardly slept. His thoughts had been filled with the river, the fighting ranchers, and the hidden well beneath his land. The more he thought, the heavier his heart felt. He knew that keeping the well only for himself might protect his family, but it would do nothing to stop the growing conflict that threatened everyone. Mary came outside carrying a small tin cup of water. She handed it to him and looked at his tired face. "You were up all night, weren't you?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded slowly. I could not stop thinking. She placed her hand on his arm. About the water? Yes, he replied. And about what might happen if this keeps going. Mary did not say anything at first. She simply stood beside him, looking out across the dry land. Finally, she spoke in a gentle but serious voice. You have always done what you believe is right. I trust you, no matter what you decide. Thomas felt both comforted and more responsible at the same time. Her words gave him strength, but they also reminded him that his choices would affect his family. After breakfast, he walked toward the hidden well. The wooden cover was still in place, just as it had been for years. He knelt down and removed it carefully. The water below shimmered softly, clear and calm. It felt almost sacred in a land where every drop had become precious. He dipped a small bucket inside and lifted it out, watching the water ripple. Even this small amount felt valuable beyond measure. He placed the bucket on the ground and stared at it for a long time, as if trying to see the future in its reflection. By midday, the heat had returned with full force. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on everything. Thomas decided to ride toward the river once more, this time with a clearer purpose. He wanted to see the situation again before making any decision. As he traveled along the dusty path, he saw signs of tension everywhere. New fences had appeared overnight. Fresh hoofprints covered the ground. In the distance, he spotted more armed men patrolling near the water. When he reached the river, the scene was worse than before. The water level had dropped even further. In some places, the river had broken into small, separate pools instead of one steady stream. Fish floated lifeless near the edges, and the banks looked dry and cracked. Two groups of ranchers stood on opposite sides of the river, glaring at each other. Their horses pawed at the ground nervously, and their hands rested near their weapons. Neither side spoke at first, but the tension between them was almost visible. Thomas stayed back, watching from behind a cluster of rocks. He felt his stomach tighten. He could sense that even a single angry word could turn this standoff into violence. After a few moments, one of the men stepped forward and shouted across the water. His voice echoed sharply in the dry air. Accusations flew back and forth, each side claiming the other was stealing water that did not belong to them. Thomas felt a deep sadness watching this. These men had once been neighbors, sometimes even friends. Now, fear and desperation had turned them into enemies. Suddenly, one of the guards raised his rifle slightly, not aiming directly but making his message clear. The other side reacted immediately, drawing their own weapons. The situation teetered on the edge of disaster. Thomas's heart began to pound. He knew that if a single shot was fired, chaos would follow. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the rocks and rode slowly toward them. Both groups noticed him at once, their shouting quieted, replaced by uneasy silence. Thomas raised his empty hands slightly, showing that he meant no harm. "What are you doing here, Hale?" one of the ranchers called out harshly. Thomas stopped his horse at a safe distance. His voice was calm but firm. "I came to see what is happening, and I see that if this continues, people will get hurt." Some men scoffed, while others stared at him with curious eyes. They were not used to a poor rancher speaking so boldly in front of powerful landowners. Thomas took a deep breath. "Look at the river," he continued. "There is less water every day. Fighting over what little remains will not bring more." A tall man from William Carter's ranch stepped forward. His face was stern and his eyes were cold. "This river runs through our land," he said. "We have the right to protect it." From the other side, a man from Samuel Brooks's ranch shouted back, "Your fences are choking the water! You are taking more than your share!" The argument began to rise again, voices growing louder and angrier. Thomas felt the moment slipping away. Without thinking further, he spoke again, this time with more strength. "I have a small well on my land. It is not much, but there is still water in it." At those words, both sides fell silent. Every man there knew how rare that was. One of the ranchers laughed bitterly. "You expect us to believe that?" "A poor rancher like you still has water?" Thomas did not flinch. You can see it for yourselves, he said calmly. But I will not let you fight over it. If you come, you must come in peace. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some men looked suspicious, others desperate. Water was worth more than gold in that moment, and the idea that Thomas might still have some shocked them. After a tense pause, one man from Brooks's side spoke up. And why would you share it with us? You barely have enough for your own family. Thomas looked at him directly. Because if you keep fighting, there will be nothing left for anyone. Not for you, not for me, not for our families. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the weak trickle of the shrinking river and the distant cry of a bird. Finally, one of Carter's men lowered his rifle slightly. If what you say is true, we will follow you. But if this is a trick, it is not. Thomas interrupted gently. I have no reason to lie. Slowly, cautiously, the two groups agreed to follow him. Thomas turned his horse and began riding back toward his ranch with a long line of riders behind him. Dust rose in thick clouds as they moved across the dry land. When they reached Thomas's property, the men looked around in surprise. They were not used to such a small, simple ranch. Some scoffed quietly, while others watched with curiosity. Thomas dismounted and walked toward the hidden well. He lifted the wooden cover, revealing the clear water beneath. Sunlight reflected off its surface, making it shine like a rare jewel. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Several men stepped forward, staring in disbelief. In a land where even rivers were dying, this well felt like a miracle. Thomas dipped a large bucket into the water and held it up. This is not just for me, he said. It is for anyone who needs it, as long as you do not fight here. At first, no one moved. Then one man stepped forward, lowering his head in respect. Thomas handed him the bucket, and he drank deeply, closing his eyes in relief. One by one, others followed. Men who had been ready to kill each other moments ago now stood side by side, sharing the same water. The tension that had filled the air slowly began to fade. Some of the men looked ashamed, realizing how close they had come to violence. Others watched Thomas with new respect, seeing him not as a poor rancher but as a man of wisdom and courage. William Carter himself arrived later, riding up with a stern expression. He dismounted and walked toward the well, his boots crunching against the dry ground. He looked at Thomas carefully. You are a strange man, Hale, Carter said. Most would guard this with their life. Thomas met his gaze calmly. My life means nothing if others suffer because of my silence. Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only thoughtful respect. As the afternoon wore on, more men arrived. Some came cautiously, others eagerly, but none came with weapons drawn. Thomas stood beside the well the entire time, ensuring that everyone behaved peacefully. Mary watched from the porch, her heart filled with both fear and pride. Jacob stood beside her, eyes wide as he saw so many powerful men drinking from their small well. By sunset, the heat had softened slightly, and the sky glowed with deep orange and red colors. The crowd of ranchers began to disperse, each returning to their own land, but they did not leave with anger in their hearts this time. Before departing, several men approached Thomas and thanked him. Some even apologized for how they had treated him in the past. Thomas accepted their words humbly, asking only that they remember this moment. As darkness fell, Thomas replaced the wooden cover over the well and stood quietly beside it. He felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but also strangely peaceful. Mary walked up beside him and placed her hand in his. You did something brave today, she said softly. Thomas looked at her and smiled faintly. I did what felt right! Inside the small house, Jacob already slept soundly, unaware of how close danger had come. The cattle rested quietly in the barn, their thirst finally eased. Across the plains, the distant river continued to shrink, but for now, the threat of violence had been pushed back. One simple act of kindness had changed the mood of an entire community. As Thomas looked up at the night sky filled with countless stars, he felt a quiet hope. The drought was not over, and the struggles were far from finished, but something important had shifted. For the first time in weeks, the Wild West felt a little less cruel, a little less lonely, and a little more human. The next morning arrived quietly, but the land did not feel the same. The sun still rose over dry plains and the heat still pressed down hard, yet something had changed in the air. The anger that once filled every conversation in town had softened, even if only a little. Thomas Hale woke before dawn as he always did. He stepped outside his small wooden house and felt the cool morning breeze brush across his face. His cattle stirred in the barn, and a distant bird called out from somewhere beyond the fields.
Everything looked the same, but Thomas felt different inside. He felt tired, yet strangely steady.
Mary was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast over the small fire. Jacob sat nearby, rubbing his eyes and yawning. When he saw his father, he smiled brightly. "Did the men leave yesterday?" Jacob asked sleepily. "Yes," Thomas replied gently. "They went back home." Jacob nodded, still half asleep, and turned his attention back to his wooden toy. Mary handed Thomas a small cup of warm tea and studied his face carefully. "You look worn out," she said softly. Thomas took a slow sip before answering. "It was a long day."
"But I think it was worth it."
Mary placed her hand over his. "I am proud of you." After breakfast, Thomas walked toward the hidden well. He removed the wooden cover and looked down at the clear water. The level had dropped slightly from all the men who had come the day before, but there was still enough left for now. He replaced the cover carefully, as if protecting something sacred. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas decided to ride into town. He wanted to see if the events of the previous day had truly made any difference. His horse moved slowly along the dusty path, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dirt. When he reached town, he immediately noticed a change. Instead of angry shouts, he heard quieter voices. Small groups of men stood together, but they spoke calmly rather than with hostility. Some even nodded respectfully as Thomas passed by.
At the general store, Mr. Sanders stepped outside when he saw Thomas approaching.
His tired face broke into a rare smile. "Morning, Thomas," he said. "I heard what you did yesterday." Thomas tipped his hat slightly. "It was nothing special. Mr. Sanders shook his head. "Don't say that. You may have stopped something terrible from happening. Inside the store, a few ranchers stood near the counter." To Thomas's surprise, some of them greeted him politely, something they had never done before. One of them even thanked him again for sharing his water. As Thomas left the store, he noticed something else. A few men from rival ranches were standing together near the edge of town, speaking calmly instead of arguing. Though their expressions were serious, they no longer looked like enemies. Curious, Thomas rode closer and listened. "We need to find a way to share what's left," one man said. Another nodded. "Fighting won't help any of us." Thomas felt a small sense of relief. His action had not solved everything, but it had opened the door for conversation. Later that day, Thomas returned home and began his usual work. He repaired a broken fence, checked on his cattle, and helped Mary with the small garden. Despite the heat, he felt a quiet sense of purpose guiding him. In the afternoon, dust rose in the distance. Thomas looked up and saw a group of riders approaching his ranch. His heart tightened at first, but as they drew closer, he recognized some of them. Among them was Samuel Brooks, one of the powerful ranch owners who had argued at the river. He dismounted respectfully and walked toward Thomas, removing his hat. "Mr. Hale," Brooks said, his voice calm. "We came to speak with you." Thomas wiped his hands on his shirt and nodded. "Go ahead." Brooks looked around the small ranch, then back at Thomas. "What you did yesterday showed us something important. We have been fighting, but you showed us another way." A few other men stepped forward, including one from William Carter's side. Together, they explained that they wanted to work toward a fair solution instead of continued conflict. Thomas listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When they finished, he spoke slowly. "I am not a rich man," he said. "I do not control the land or the river. But I do know that if you work together, you might save what little is left." Brooks nodded. "That is why we came. We want your help." Thomas felt both surprised and uneasy.
Help with what? The men explained their idea.
They wanted to build a simple canal system that would carry water from the river to different ranches fairly. Instead of fencing off the river, they would share it through planned channels. Thomas considered this carefully. It was a difficult task, but not impossible. He had worked with land and water for years and understood how they behaved. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "I will help, but only if everyone agrees to be peaceful." The men quickly agreed. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. Ranchers who had once refused to speak to each other now worked side by side. They brought tools, horses, and workers to help dig channels along the dry land. Thomas stood among them, guiding the work with quiet confidence. He explained where the water could flow naturally and where it might get blocked. Though he held no official power, his voice carried weight because of the respect he had earned. At first, progress was slow. The ground was hard and cracked, making digging difficult. Some men grew frustrated and argued over small details. But Thomas remained calm, reminding them of what they had nearly lost to anger. One afternoon, as they worked near the river, William Carter himself arrived. His expression was serious, but not arrogant as before. He walked up to Thomas and extended his hand. "You were right," Carter admitted. "Fighting would have destroyed us." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "It is not too late to make things better." Carter nodded and joined the workers, lifting a shovel like everyone else. Seeing such a powerful man working alongside ordinary ranch hands surprised many people, but it also inspired them to keep going. Back at his ranch, Mary watched these changes with quiet pride. She saw how her husband moved among the men, speaking gently but confidently, guiding them without ever trying to control them. Jacob, too, noticed the shift. He often asked his father questions about the canal and why the men were finally working together. Thomas answered patiently, teaching his son about cooperation and fairness. Weeks passed, and the canal slowly took shape. Though the river remained low, the new channels allowed water to reach different lands in a more balanced way. It was not a perfect solution, but it was far better than constant fighting. One evening, after a long day of work, the ranchers gathered near the partially completed canal. The sun sank low in the sky, casting golden light over the dry land. For the first time in months, the men did not look at each other with suspicion. Samuel Brooks stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We could not have come this far without Thomas Hale," he said loudly. "A man with little land and little wealth, but great wisdom." Several men nodded in agreement. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, not used to such attention. "I did not do this alone," he said quietly. "You did it together." As night fell, small campfires flickered along the work site. Men who had once been enemies sat together, sharing simple meals and quiet conversation. The harshness of the Wild West still surrounded them, but in that moment, it felt less cruel. Meanwhile, back at his ranch, Thomas stood beside his well once again. He looked down at the water, which now felt less like a private treasure and more like a symbol of what could be achieved through kindness. Mary joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you think this will last?" she asked softly. Thomas gazed out across the plains. "I do not know, but at least they are trying." In the distance, thunder rolled faintly across the sky. Dark clouds gathered near the horizon, a rare and hopeful sight. Though no rain fell that night, the promise of it lingered. The next morning, work on the canal continued. More settlers from nearby areas arrived, offering their help. Word had spread that former rivals were now working together instead of fighting. Some even called it a small miracle. As the days went on, Thomas noticed something else changing. People in town spoke with more respect toward one another. Even those who had treated him poorly before now greeted him kindly. Yet Thomas did not let pride enter his heart. He remained humble, focusing on his family and his work. One late afternoon, as he stood near the river supervising the canal, he saw something that made his breath catch. A thin line of water began flowing steadily through the first completed channel. It shimmered in the sunlight, winding its way across the dry land toward waiting fields. A cheer rose from the men. Some shouted with joy, others simply stood in silent awe. After so much struggle, their effort was finally paying off. Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because he had been praised, but because he had helped bring peace where there had once been anger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with deep red and purple hues, the men gathered once more. This time, their faces were filled with hope rather than fear. William Carter approached Thomas and spoke quietly. "You changed more than just our water. You changed how we see each other." Thomas smiled faintly. "I only reminded you of what you already knew." That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast sky, the Wild West felt different. The drought still lingered, the land was still harsh, and life was still difficult, but something important had shifted. Neighbors were becoming partners, rivals were becoming allies. And all of it had begun with one poor rancher who chose kindness over fear. Back at his small ranch, Thomas sat on the porch with his family. Jacob leaned against his side, already half asleep. Mary rested her head on his shoulder, content and peaceful. Across the plains, the faint sound of water moving through the new canal could be heard, a gentle reminder that cooperation had replaced conflict. As the months passed, life on Thomas Callahan's ranch slowly began to change for the better. The water that had once been the source of so much tension now flowed more freely, shared among the ranchers, the settlers, and even the nearby Native American tribe, thanks to the truce Thomas and Chief Red Hawk had helped establish. People spoke of the agreement with respect and admiration, especially as the once dry fields began to show signs of life. For Thomas, however, the real reward wasn't in the crops or the land's newfound abundance, but in the peace that had settled over the land. It was something he never thought possible in a place as wild and unforgiving as the West. In the early days after the truce, there was a certain unease among the ranchers. Old habits were hard to shake. Nathaniel Kane, who had been the most vocal opponent of sharing the water, still carried the weight of his pride. But even he, after a season of seeing his cattle thrive thanks to the agreement, began to soften. Slowly, he accepted the idea that there was more to gain from cooperation than there had been in competition. For Thomas, seeing Kane's change was almost as rewarding as seeing his own ranch prosper. He had always believed in the power of fairness, and now, in a land where the strong often took what they wanted by force, he had proven that kindness and cooperation could stand tall. The other ranchers, too, were learning from the example set by Thomas. They had watched him, a man who had little but his integrity, stand firm in the face of pressure, yet never resort to violence or greed. It was a quiet victory, but it was one that changed the hearts of many. The truce had not only brought peace among the ranchers and the tribe, but also helped to unite the community. Neighbors who had once viewed each other with distrust now gathered together more often. Thomas and Grace, his wife, began to host gatherings at their ranch, where people from all walks of life came together to share meals, stories, and laughter. It was at these gatherings that the true power of the truce became clear. It was not just about water or land, but about creating a space where people could see each other as equals, not competitors. The town, too, began to feel the effects of the truce. Merchants and farmers who had once struggled to make a living in such a harsh environment found that with the cooperation of the local ranchers, their businesses began to grow. The town was no longer a place where every man fought for what little he could hold on to, but a place where people worked together to ensure that everyone had a chance at success. One of the most surprising changes, however, came from the Native American tribe. Chief Red Hawk, who had initially been seen by many as just another outsider, was now regarded as a wise leader and ally. His reputation for fairness and peace spread throughout the West, and soon other tribes began to approach him, seeking his counsel on matters of land and resources. Red Hawk's influence grew, and so did the respect between the settlers and the Native Americans. The truce had planted the seed for a relationship that, while still fragile, had the potential to reshape the future of the region. For Thomas and his family, life had settled into a new rhythm. The constant worry of how they would survive had been replaced with the joy of seeing their land thrive. Their ranch, once barren and struggling, was now lush and green, with cattle grazing contentedly in the fields. The drought that had threatened to destroy everything had passed, and with it, so had the fear that Thomas would lose everything he had worked for. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. Thomas found himself looking at the world differently, too. Before the truce, he had always been a man who acted out of necessity, doing whatever he could to survive. But now, he saw the value in helping others, in offering kindness, even when it wasn't easy. The truce had shown him that sometimes the greatest strength a person can have is the ability to forgive and the willingness to work together for the greater good. As the years passed, the legacy of the truce lived on. Thomas's children grew up in a world where cooperation and respect were the norms, not the exceptions. They learned from their father the importance of kindness, of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. And though they would go on to face their own challenges in life, they would always remember the lesson that their father had taught them, that peace, though hard to come by, was worth every sacrifice. The story of the water truce became a part of Wild West history, passed down through generations. It was told as a tale of a poor rancher who, in the face of overwhelming odds, chose kindness over conflict, and in doing so, changed the course of history. It was a story that reminded everyone, no matter how tough the land or how fierce the competition, that peace could always be found if people were willing to work for it. And so, the land that had once been scarred by greed and violence became a place of hope and prosperity. The truce, forged by Thomas Callahan and Chief Red Hawk, had not only saved a community but had given birth to a new way of thinking, one that valued cooperation over conflict and kindness over cruelty. It was a legacy that would endure long after Thomas's time, reminding everyone who came after him that in the end it wasn't power or wealth that shaped history, but the choices people made and the kindness they were willing to show one another.